Virtualization is becoming more and more common in the workplace. Virtualization allows you to take a number of existing servers and run them on one server. Doing this can reduce your costs, as well as having a wide range of other benefits. With virtualization becoming so popular, it is no surprise then that Microsoft is putting a lot of development behind virtualization. With Windows 2008, a new technology called Hyper-V makes its appearance. Hyper-V decreases the overhead in virtualization, and thus greatly improves its performance. Depending on your needs will determine your virtualization solution. This section will go through virtualization and the different solutions available to you. A virtual machine emulates a real computer. You can run as many virtual machines on the one physical computer as you want, limited only by the RAM and other resources. The physical computer running the virtual machine is called the host. A virtual machine running on the host is known as the guest. The guest operating system runs on the host and has its own RAM allocated from the host. The guest shares the CPU with the host, but is isolated from the host. To better understand, consider this example. In this example, the one physical computer is running Windows Server 2008 64-bit. This computer is running 4 virtual computers. Depending on the virtual solution you are running will determine if you can run 64-bit virtual machines or not. You, however, cannot run any 64-bit machines if your CPU and OS are not 64-bit. In this example, there is a mixture of 64-bit and 32-bit virtual machines. Notice also, you can run non-Microsoft operating systems like Red Hat Linux. Depending on how powerful your hardware is, will determine how many virtual machines you can run and how well they will run. There are a lot of benefits to virtualization, and that is why it is becoming more and more common in the workplace. Let's have a look at some of the benefits. One of the major benefits of virtualization technology is its ability to simplify disaster recovery. Since a virtual machine is stored in a number of files, these files can easily be moved from one computer to another with different hardware. Using shadow copies, you can back up a complete server image while the server is running. If the server fails, all you need to do is restore the files for the virtual machine back to the computer, or even a completely different computer. To make this simpler, you can purchase System Center Virtual Machine Manager to manage your virtual machines. Using System Center Virtual Machine Manager, you can move virtual machines to and from your SAN, and even to another server. If you don't have System Center Virtual Machine Manager, you can simply copy or restore the file from one server to another manually. This gives virtualization easy portability. If the server running your virtual machines is blue screening due to a hardware problem, virtualization makes it easy to copy the image from one server to another and restart the virtual machine. You don't need to worry about reinstalling drivers. The virtual machine will just work on the new server. Because you can easily move virtual machines around, virtualization allows you to efficiently use resources. If you have a number of servers that are using a small amount of CPU, you may consider consolidating all these servers onto one server. Doing this allows you to better use the CPU. Consider this example. You are asked to set up a new application server. You look at the specs and determine that the CPU use will be low and requires about 1 GB of RAM. Of the two servers, you decide to place it on the left server as it has more free CPU. After the server is installed, you get complaints for slow performance. You look at the server and realize it is using 2 gigs of RAM instead of 1. With virtual machines, you can quickly move the virtual server from server to server. After you move the virtual server to the right server, you soon start to get complaints again. You look at the virtual server again and discover that more people are using it than originally expected. Its memory use has gone up to 3 GB. You have no choice now but to buy more RAM. Unfortunately, the right server cannot support any more RAM. It has a limit of 4 GB. You instead upgrade the left server and move the virtual server back again. As you can see, virtual machines are very easy to move around. If your needs suddenly change, you can respond in a way that best uses the resources that you have. If you need to add more resources later on, you can easily allocate them to virtual machines as required. Virtualization also goes far beyond saving money on RAM and CPU. By having a few powerful servers instead of a lot of small servers, virtualization allows you to have better and more reliable servers. If you have a few powerful servers, unless you have unlimited funds of course, you can install more redundancy in the form of additional power supplies, network cards, fiber cards, and even CPUs. Consider this example. Instead of buying a lot of small servers, the money you save could be put towards buying additional switches. With the money you save, if you are connecting via a SAN, you could purchase an additional fiber card. In this example, this server has 2 network cards and 2 fiber cards. If either one of the fiber switches or network switches fail, the server will continue to function. If there were 4 virtual servers running on this one server, to provide the same level of redundancy using 4 physical servers, you would require 4 times as many ports on your fiber and network switches and 4 times as many network cards and fiber cards. As you can see, the costs can quickly skyrocket. If the server does go down, it does take a lot more services down than just a single server running a single application. However, using your budget wisely, you can install a very stable server with just a few single points of failure, and this makes failures rare. Having a smaller number of servers, it is a lot easier to add additional RAM than adding RAM to a lot of smaller servers. You can also allocate the RAM and CPU any way you want between the virtual machines to best utilize your resources. If a server needs more RAM to run a large job, you can unallocate RAM from the other virtual servers and allocate it to the virtual server that needs it. Once the job has finished, you can allocate the RAM back. Without server virtualization, you would have to remove the RAM from one server and place it in another. Using virtualization, you can isolate your virtual servers from the network. This allows you to have a test environment which you can try out new applications and services without affecting the rest of your network. You can even install services like DHCP and network booting in a virtual environment, and this will not affect your production environment. Previously, to do this kind of testing, you would need to set up a test environment that was isolated from the rest of the network. Now with virtualization, you can do all this kind of testing on your desktop computer. Virtualization allows you to provide services only when needed. If you have an enterprise root CA, it is considered best practice for this server to be available only when it is needed. With server virtualization, you could place the enterprise root CA on a removable USB drive. When you need the enterprise CA, start the virtual machine from the USB drive. When it is not needed anymore, store the USB drive in a safe. This provides security for your certificates and also does not waste server hardware when it is only needed infrequently. Once you have decided to run virtual machines, you need to make a decision which software you will use to run your virtual machines. Microsoft offer the following virtualization software: Virtual PC 2007, Virtual Server 2005, and Hyper-V. It is also worth mentioning VMware Server as a third-party virtualization solution. You won't be tested on this in the Microsoft exam, but VMware Server is an excellent third-party virtualization solution that a lot of companies use. Depending on your needs and the operating systems that you are running, will determine which virtualization solution you can use. The first solution offered by Microsoft is Virtual PC 2007. Virtual PC 2007 can run on Windows Server 2003 and 2008, Windows Vista, Windows XP Professional, and Windows Tablet. This gives you a wide range of hardware platforms to run on. Keep in mind that the host in virtualization terms refers to the computer that is running the virtual machines on it. The guest is the virtual machine that is running on the host. Virtual PC 2007 supports the following guest or virtual machines: Windows Server 2003, Windows Server 2008, Windows Vista, Windows XP Professional, Windows 2000, Windows 98, and OS 2. This is the supported list, but you are free to install other OSs if you choose. When this training program was put together, Virtual PC 2007 only supported 32-bit guest operating systems. This may change in the future. You can download a 64-bit version of Virtual Server 2007. However, the 64-bit version will still only allow you to run 32-bit guest operating systems. Even though they are not supported by Microsoft, you can still install MS-DOS, Windows 95, Windows NT4, and Linux on a virtual machine. These operating systems should still work, but Microsoft will not support them if something goes wrong. Virtual PC 2007 has a limit of 1 CPU per guest or virtual machine. If you have a CPU that has multiple cores, the virtual machine will only see one. With all the virtual machine solutions, one of the key features is network support. In network settings, you can configure your network adapter in a number of different ways. The first is local only. This option only provides networking support between virtual machines only. All virtual machines connected to local only will only be able to send data to each other. This data will not be sent to any other host on the network. If you want to create a completely isolated test network, select this option. If you select sharing network or NAT, This option piggybacks the virtual machine onto the host computer's network. Any virtual machine with this setting will appear to be just like any other physical computer connected to the network. Lastly, you can connect your virtual machine up to a specific network adapter. If you have a virtual machine that is using a lot of network bandwidth, you can use this setting to put it on its own adapter. When placed on its own network adapter, the virtual machine acts like any other physical computer connected to the network, except that the virtual machine is the only one that uses that adapter. Not even the host will use this adapter. All these network settings are available in any virtualization solution that you choose. Keep in mind that virtual PC networking is limited when compared with other virtualization solutions. For example, virtual PC only allows you to have one private network. This means that if you had two groups of test virtual machines, you could not place them on their own separate private isolated networks. Microsoft Virtual Server 2005 Release 2 with Service Pack 1 is designed for server operating systems. It expands on the features of Virtual PC 2007 and adds additional guest support for Red Hat Linux, SUSE Linux, Solaris and Windows NT Server with Service Pack 6a. Virtual Server 2005 adds remote management capabilities, so you can configure and control your virtual machines from a different computer. Virtual Server 2005 also adds SCSI support and also multiprocessor support. With Virtual Server 2005, you can assign a single core or CPU to a virtual machine. Using Virtual Server 2005 Migration Toolkit, you can migrate a physical computer to a virtual computer. Keep in mind that at the time this course was put together, neither Virtual Server 2005 or Virtual PC 2007 supported 64-bit virtual machines. Before looking at the latest Microsoft virtualization solution Hyper-V, it's worth looking at VMware Server as a third-party solution. Microsoft will not test you on this. However, in some cases, if you need to run 64-bit guests, VMware Server may be your only choice. Firstly, VMware supports 64-bit virtual machines. Hyper-V is the only Microsoft solution that runs 64-bit guests. If your hardware does not support Hyper-V, or you're not running Windows Server 2008, and you need to run 64-bit guests, then VMware is your only choice. Besides the Microsoft operating systems, VMware also has good guest support for Linux and Solaris. Lastly, VMware also runs on Linux. If you want to host your virtual machine solution on a non-Microsoft system, then VMware is for you. If you can't run Hyper-V and you need 64-bit virtual machines, VMware may be your only choice till Microsoft adds 64-bit guest support to Virtual PC and Virtual Server. Microsoft's newest virtualization solution is Hyper-V. If you look at how pre-Hyper-V solutions work, they run as an application on top of the operating system. This essentially means that the virtual machine goes through the operating system to get to the hardware. As shown in this example, in order for Virtual Machine 1 to get to the hardware, it must go through the operating system. This presents some problems. Firstly, it slows down the virtual machine as there are more software layers it must go through to get to the hardware. Secondly, there are some security concerns. If the host operating system was to be compromised, it may be possible to compromise the guest virtual operating system running on the host. Hyper-V changes this, in that the virtualization is no longer performed by the operating system. With Hyper-V, the operating system runs alongside the virtual machines. This offers better performance and security. If the operating system is compromised, the attacker will not be able to gain access to the virtual machines, or at least it will be a lot harder. The virtual machines also have a lot less layers to go through to get to the hardware, making them run faster. Hyper-V is Microsoft's latest virtualization software, and currently only available on Windows Server 2008. What makes Hyper-V different from other virtualization software is that it runs as part of the operating system. Hyper-V is Microsoft's latest virtualization software, and currently only available on Windows Server 2008. What makes Hyper-V different from other virtualization software is that it runs as part of the operating system. Other virtualization software runs as an application on top of the existing operating system. Running as part of the operating system makes Hyper-V faster than other virtualization solutions. In order to run Hyper-V, you will need a 64-bit CPU with hardware-assisted virtualization. Intel chips refer to this as Intel VT, and AMD chips refer to this as AMD V. Check with the manufacturer before you buy to make sure it supports this requirement. In order to run Hyper-V, you will need the 64-bit edition of Windows Server 2008, either the Standard Edition, Enterprise, or Data Center. Hyper-V can be installed on either Windows Server 2008 Full Edition or the Server Core Edition. Hyper-V at this stage is not available for the web server or Titanium edition of Windows Server 2008. It is doubtful this will change in the future. When this course was created, Microsoft was planning to release a Hyper-V edition of Windows. This edition of Windows will only run Hyper-V and thus should be very fast. As of today, Microsoft have not released many details about this new Hyper-V edition. If you want more details, please check the Microsoft website. In order to run Hyper-V, you will need to enable virtualization in your BIOS. If your BIOS does not have this option, you may need to update your BIOS. Hyper-V also requires data execution protection, which may or may not have an option in your BIOS. It should, however, be on by default. When I installed Hyper-V, the BIOS I used did not have the option to switch on data execution protection. It did, however, have an option to switch on hardware-assisted virtualization after I performed the BIOS update. So don't worry too much if you can't find data execution protection option in your BIOS. It may not be there. Lastly, check if your motherboard is compatible. Newer motherboards should work fine. However, some of the older motherboards may not work. Hyper-V is a very powerful feature-rich virtualization solution. You can allocate up to 32 GB of RAM per guest, assuming the operating system that you are running in the virtual machine supports that much. Hyper-V also offers 32-bit and 64-bit guest virtual machine support. You do require a 64-bit CPU to run Hyper-V, but you are free to run any operating system architecture that you like in your virtual machines. Hyper-V supports multi-CPU and multi-core, allowing you to assign a single CPU or a maximum of 4 cores to one virtual machine. Hyper-V also has enhanced network load balancing support. The virtual switch capabilities in Hyper-V allow you to configure network load balancing easily. If you have an AMD CPU, you can check if your CPU is compatible with Hyper-V by downloading the Hyper-V compatibility tool from the AMD website. It is a very difficult URL to remember, but if you go to the AMD website and select Support and Downloads, and then select the link Utilities and Drivers for any of the listed CPUs, you should find a link for the utility. When you run the Hyper-V utility, you should get this message. This will let you know that your CPU supports Hyper-V and that virtualization is enabled in your BIOS. Otherwise, you may need to enable it in your BIOS or apply a BIOS update. Intel does not seem to offer the same type of Hyper-V test utility. However, you can download a free tool from Gibson Research Corporation that works with any CPU. If you run the utility and get the following screen, then your system will support Hyper-V. If you have no in hardware DEP or hardware virtualization, check your BIOS settings. If these settings are not in your BIOS, you may need to upgrade your BIOS and enable them. The best way to learn about Hyper-V is to see it in action. Let's go through installing Hyper-V and setting up and running virtual machines. To install Hyper-V, it is just a matter of running Server Manager from Administrative Tools and adding the Hyper-V role. Hyper-V was not available until 180 days after the release of Windows Server 2008, and for this reason, your media may not have Hyper-V on it. If this is the case, Hyper-V will not appear as a role in Server Manager until you download and install Hyper-V from the Microsoft website. The Hyper-V install wizard will now ask which network adapter you want to assign to Hyper-V. This provides a bridge between Hyper-V and your network. You can also add and subtract network adapters after the install. Once the install has completed, you will need to reboot your computer. On this computer, virtualization has not been enabled in the BIOS. Once the computer reboots, enter the BIOS and look around for the virtualization setting. In this BIOS, it is in the CPU section. On this computer, I needed to perform a BIOS update before the virtualization setting appeared. So if something similar does not appear in your BIOS, you may need to update the BIOS first. Once virtualization is enabled, all I need to do now is reboot back into Windows Server 2008. Once I log back in, Server Manager will start and finish the setup. When adding roles to your server, remember, always log back in as the same user to make sure the install finishes correctly. Once the install is complete, it is a good idea to run Windows Update. Hyper-V is a very new technology, and Microsoft are constantly updating it. The original Hyper-V shipped with Windows 2008 only ran on a small amount of hardware and was a release candidate. In other words, it was not the finished version. Since then, it has expanded and become more stable. If I look in Windows Update, the recommended update at the bottom is for Hyper-V. This update takes Hyper-V to RTM, or release to manufacture. I highly recommend installing this update for Hyper-V if it is not already installed. Running the older release candidate is not recommended. After the update is complete, I will have to reboot again, but it is worth the wait. Now that Hyper-V is installed and up to date, I can now run it and create some virtual machines. To run Hyper-V, run the admin tool from Administrative Tools in the Start menu. You will notice on the far left-hand side that you have an option to import virtual machines. If you have any existing virtual machines, you can import them here, including virtual machines made with other products like Microsoft Virtual Server. To create a new virtual machine, select the option New and then select Virtual Machine. From the wizard, enter the name of the virtual machine. If you want to store the virtual machine in a special location, you could select the option at the bottom, Store the virtual machine in a different location. In the next screen, you can allocate how much memory you want the virtual machine to use. Set the value on how much memory you think it is going to need. You can always change it later. In the networking section, I can select the network to use my existing network card. If you created a private network earlier on, you can select it here and create a virtual machine isolated from your production network. On the next screen, you can create a hard disk for your virtual machine. Each hard disk is stored as a file. If you restore a hard disk from a backup or copied it from another server, you could specify the hard disk here. From here, I can select where to install the operating system from. You can install from DVD, ISO image, or even off the network if you wish. In this example, I won't install any operating system. That's it, the virtual machine is created and ready to use. Before I start using the virtual machine, I will go through the settings for the virtual machine. First of all, you can add additional hardware like SCSI controllers and network adapters. This is one of the things that makes virtualization so great. You could create a completely isolated virtual network and have one server to perform routing between this network and your production network. This means you can simulate your own DMZ or perimeter network, or even your production environment in an environment that is completely isolated. This makes virtualization a great tool to test new technology safely. If you select the BIOS option, you can change the boot order. Next, if you select memory, you can change how much RAM the virtual machine has access to. On the processor screen, you can allocate the number of CPUs the virtual machine has access to. On this screen, you can also set a limit on how much CPU the virtual machine can use. If you set a relative weight to the virtual machine, Hyper-V will allocate a CPU with priority based on this value. If you have a server that is using a lot of CPU, you can limit it so that other services do not suffer. On the ID controller section, you can change which controller the operating system will see the hard disk on. You can also change the hard disk if you wish. In the network adapter screen, you can select the network card that you want to use. You can also set the MAC address and enable VLANs if you wish. Down in the management section, you can add notes about the server. This can be useful when you have a lot of servers and forget what is installed on each one. Integrated Services allows you to select which services that you want to provide to your virtual machine. If you are running a domain controller in a virtual machine, you may want to switch off time synchronization. Domain controllers provide time synchronization to other members of the domain. If you enable this option, the local physical server will try and sync the domain controller to its time. This will result in the clock on both servers starting to drift from the real time. In the automatic start action, you may want to take note of some of these options. By default, if the physical server is restarted or crashes, only those virtual machines that were running will start up again when the physical server starts. Take note of the startup delay option. In a production environment, you may have a domain controller and other critical services that you need to start first. Setting a delay on non-critical servers allows time for the critical servers to start. Servers like Windows Update Server or Backup Server can have a long delay since they are not critical. If no delays are set, and you have a lot of virtual machines on the same physical server trying to start at once, when all the virtual machines try to start at once, there will be a lot of I/O, which puts a lot of strain on the system. Automatic stop action defines what virtual machines will do when the server is shut down. For example, if a UPS shuts the server down during a power failure. By default, the virtual machine state will be saved, and when the server starts up again, it will carry on from where it left off. If your server is processing a big job, this may be what you want. If the server is a domain controller, you may just want to shut it down. It really depends on what your needs are, what you set here. Even though the virtual machine is off, I can go down and select Snapshot. This will take a snapshot of the current state of the virtual machine, which I can revert back to later on. In simple terms, it means this. I can go and make any changes I want, and then press revert, and the server is back the way it was before. The virtual machine is not running, so I will now connect to it and start it up. There is no operating system on this virtual machine, so it will not boot correctly. To demonstrate snapshots, I don't need an operating system. Now I can take a snapshot of the virtual machine. You can see under snapshot there is now 2 snapshots. The next feature I really love. Just say I want to revert back to the first snapshot. If I select it and press apply, I have the option to go back to that snapshot. If I take another snapshot, you will see that I have 3 snapshots. The green forward icon shows the snapshot that is currently running. I can now easily switch between different snapshots at different times. To put it in perspective, you could be working on a server and decide that you need to make some changes. You take a snapshot and make the changes. You think, wait, these changes aren't what I wanted. You go back to the old snapshot and make some more changes. You then think, this is even worse than the original changes. You then decide to go back to the snapshot with the original changes. Snapshots give you all the freedom to go backwards and forwards in time at your leisure. That's it for this Hyper-V demo. You will find that once you start using Hyper-V, that it is easy to use and very powerful. Hyper-V, Virtual Server, and Virtual PC all use the same hard disk format, which comes in 3 different types. The first is dynamically expanding. The hard disk format expands as required. This type gives you the smallest size, but also the slowest performance. If you delete some data from your hard disk, it will not be removed from the hard disk, and thus, the hard disk file may be larger than the data that you have on the hard disk. With dynamically expanding disks, you can compact the hard disk, which will reclaim the deleted hard disk space. The next hard disk type is fixed. The fixed hard disk gives you the best performance, but does create a file as large as the hard disk you specify. The last type is differentiating. This hard disk type works in a parent-child relationship. Once you have created the parent hard disk, you then create a link between that and the child disk. Any changes made to the hard disk are stored on the child hard disk, leaving the parent hard disk the same. In other words, the child hard disk is storing the changes between the two. This means that if you later decide to remove the differentiating child hard disk, the original parent hard disk will remain the same. If you wanted to merge the changes, there is also an option to do this. Since the child is linked to the parent, if you change the parent, all child hard disks linked to this parent will reflect this change. If you are using differential hard disks, I would recommend making the parent hard disk read-only. When you are running an operating system in a virtual environment, it still needs to be licensed correctly. If you are running Windows Server 2008 Enterprise, then you can run free of charge 4 virtual Windows servers. This includes earlier editions of Windows Server like 2000 and Windows NT, as long as it is no more than 4. If you want to run more than 4, you can purchase another enterprise license and add another 4 virtual servers. If you are running Windows Server 2008 Data Center, you can run an unlimited number of virtual servers running Windows free of charge. If you are running Standard or Web Edition, you cannot run any virtual Windows servers free of charge. If you are not sure, check with Microsoft to make sure that you have the correct number of licenses for your host and guest operating systems.